It is now in order to consider amendment number 6, printed in House Report 116-289. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in House Report number 116-289, offered by Ms. Tlaib of Michigan.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 695, the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment would require that XM provide an annual report to the United States Congress on the agency's activity in economically disadvantaged areas and efforts that they are taking to support those areas. Government must be about people first. So when we talk about economic opportunity, Mr. Chair, we must ensure that we are using every tool possible to uplift communities who are struggling, like my district. After the Great Recession of 2008, the country experienced an economic recovery from 2011 to 2015, but already vulnerable communities missed out on the most of that growth and opportunity. There's no question that some communities suffer more and take longer to recover, and sometimes it takes decades longer, but it shouldn't be this way. There is evidence that adequate reporting and proper investment may be able to speed that pace of recovery for these kinds of communities. According to the Economic Innovation Group, 52.3 million people, or 17% of the American population, experienced an average 6% drop in the number of adults working and a 6.3% average drop in the number of business establishments. Specifically, Mr. Chair, workers and their families living in especially hard-hit communities face challenges such as unemployment that are often arises from mass layoffs associated with declines in specific industries and businesses. For communities like mine, 13 districts strong, the impact on employment and income can be extremely persistent. Currently, Detroit is one of the 5 cities with the greatest number of people in distressed zip codes and rank number 10 as the most distressed city in the United States of the country's 100th largest cities. Wayne County, Michigan, which I represent, ranks 2nd in the nation for inequality with job creation. Addressing the economic and social costs associated with persistent localized economic distresses requires adequate reporting, as it is essential to addressing the causes and the cost of long-term economic distress for workers, their families, and the communities. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to help ensure that we have tools to uplift every community across the country like mine. I yield back the rest of the balance of my time, Mr. Chair.
Does a young lady reserve, gentlewoman reserve, or
Sure, I reserve.
Yield back?
I would like to reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
I wish to claim time in opposition, though I'm not opposed to the amendment.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Let me say first that Republicans unanimously voted to support the Waters-McHenry bipartisan deal to strengthen the bank and combat Chinese aggression, but we're not going to support this partisan bill here on the floor today. This amendment's a fine one. This amendment, as with some other amendments that the Democrats are offering today, that the Rules Committee made in order. As I understand it, they made in order 19 Democrat amendments and 2 Republican amendments. So it's quite a ratio. But I think there's a point where additional reporting requirements, as I said earlier, and other mandates can burden an agency to the point of diminishing returns. If you want the Export-Import Bank to be effective, it's often better to advocate for initiatives within the bank, like the Waters-McHenry bill, and make the bank focus on priorities. This is one area with opportunity zones that we've supported in a bipartisan way to get investment in disadvantaged communities across the country. Those opportunity zones are part of now tax law. That bill standalone was a bipartisan one last Congress and the Congress before that had great consensus. And so what the gentlelady from Michigan is advocating here matches up quite nicely with that to ensure that the bank is focused on those same areas that have been historically disadvantaged or economically have been left behind. Some of those areas are in my district, some are in her district, but they're throughout the country. So as I said, I do not oppose the amendment. I support the amendment, and I think it's important for the bank to focus on important communities across the country, but especially those that are economically disadvantaged. So with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. Does the gentlewoman have any closing remarks?
Yes, I think it's really important. I'm glad the ranking member did mention the opportunity zone. One of the things in key controversy around the opportunity zones right now is that 5 out of the hundreds of opportunity zone census tracts that were chosen, 5 of which did not qualify under the poverty guidelines and requirements for opportunity zones. Reporting like this creates transparency and accountability, Mr. Chair, and that's why it's critically important that we don't make the mistake again to support these kinds of tax breaks and loans and opportunities through the federal government without any accountability and follow through with the United States Congress annually. That's why it's critically important. I mean, we're talking about 5 communities that should not have gotten the opportunity zone designation, including 2 in the city of Detroit that was promoted by billionaire Dan Gilbert, and that it should never have been designated. They didn't qualify, Mr. Chair, and that's why it's important that we have these kinds of amendments and requirements that the United States Congress can then proceed to create transparency. And I fully support, obviously, opportunities to development in communities that deserve it, especially representing the 3rd poorest congressional district in the country. However, we cannot allow those political donors like the billionaire Dan Gilbert to pick and choose where those opportunity zones are designated. However, we're talking about XM today, and let's do this right by supporting this kind of annual reporting to make sure that we are helping economic disadvantaged communities like ours to be able to, again, have accountability for the American people. Again, I rise in support of, I hope my colleagues support me in rising in support of this amendment, again, to make sure that we do our due diligence as members of Congress in making sure no other kind of scandalous controversy that we see now currently with the opportunity zones in our country.
Gentlewoman reserves or yields back?
Reserves.
Gentlewoman reserves.
Yield myself such time as I may consume.
A gentleman for North Carolina.
I would say, Mr. Chair, to my colleague from Michigan, under the opportunity zones provision of the tax bill we passed last year, governors designate those census tracts. So if the gentlelady has a problem with the census tracts designated in Michigan, that is a problem with the governor of Michigan, not the underlying important tax law. I would also commend to my colleague, this is her first term in Congress. 2 Congresses ago, this was a bipartisan bill. It had wide bipartisan support. And we had a similar number of Republicans and Democrats support the Opportunity Zone legislation. And I think it's really important, powerful legislation, an important law now that is going to have a strong impact on those economically disadvantaged communities, many in my district and those across the country. And I think it's going to have a very positive effect over the long term. And so, as I would say again, I support this amendment, will not oppose, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman.
Thank you so much. Again, I completely agree that that is the process. However, it is our responsibility that we are the ones who created the bipartisan support of opportunity zones. However, it doesn't make it exempt from corruption, Mr. Chair, and that's exactly what's happening. So then Governor Snyder may have gave his friend an advantage by not complying with the opportunity zone requirement that it be a poverty-stricken census tract, that it's within those guidelines. That did not happen. So it's our due diligence, because we allowed the pathway for opportunity zones to have accountability. And this amendment basically allows us to check in, Mr. Chair, and make sure that they are following those guidelines. And that's exactly what didn't happen with the opportunity zones. Just because it was bipartisan does not mean it's exempt from corruption. It's exempt from accountability. And I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle join me in having transparency and accountability. It is our responsibility. It is our tax dollars. It is our programs that we have to, again, hold accountable for those that take advantage by using the system and tainting that process. So thank you so much, and I yield the rest of my time.
The gentlewoman has yielded her time. Gentleman from North Carolina.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Michigan. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is